Quite a few of you came to Porty Radar Museum yesterday, and most of you understood how radar works, which is fairly unusual for quite a lot of our visitors to the museum. But of course, what Barry is going to do today is explain how people tried to prove that radar could be avoided, could be got around, for want of a better expression. And as you can see from the slide, he's going to be talking about a number of issues, but not all issues, I think it's fair to say, Barry. So over to you.
Good morning, everyone. This is basically what I'm going to attempt to do in the next 40 minutes or so. I better set the background first. Why am I giving a talk on this topic? I spent my career in academia, but for the majority of that, I carried out research in stealth technology. And for 25 years, I acted as a consultant to various clients who were interested in the practical applications of this sort of thing. Right, so the proper title of this talk is to do with its history in technology. Because I'm dealing with a very sensitive topic, unfortunately I won't be talking about the sort of things I've actually done in the real world. So I've had to put together a presentation which is taken from publicly available information. That's been carefully filtered because obviously there's quite a lot of media hype out there basically, as well as other things. Right, so what do we actually mean by stealth? Stealth technology actually comes under various headings. Some people call it low observable technology. There are various things that people call it by. But essentially it means doing something secretly or in a hidden manner. Now, stealth is not new. I mean, since time immemorial, people have used some sort of stealth technology, and I'm thinking here of camouflage when you're out hunting for food. So that would be a very early example of what we might term now as stealth technology. But we're really interested in the context of today's talk about what sort of means can we use to detect an object. What sort of phenomena can we use to detect an object? And this is a list of typical sensors, if you like, that might be looking for particular signals against a background of noise. I'm going to really talk about, in more detail, about probably the first two of these. I think that's probably, although I will give you some examples of some of the others. So let's start off and say, why is stealth important? Well, firstly, it might confer an object with properties which make it harder to detect at long range. And so this will give less time for defences to react to that threat. The second reason why it's important is that if you can use some form of stealth technology, you may be able to use less electronic warfare resources to help you in that act of concealment. And thirdly, this is a military term really, that stealth acts as a force multiplier. In other words, you get more bangs for your buck basically with smaller number of assets. Well, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here will be pictures, and I've got one or two things to pass around just to give you an idea of what's going on. I appreciate that some people in the audience are well versed in what I'm talking about, but this talk is really meant for a more general audience. On the left-hand side, we have the iconic Spitfire, and this was typical of the sort of visual camouflage that would have been used in World War II. On the right-hand side is an example of what you could do using things called fractal patterns. So these are mathematically generated patterns. And obviously here, in that photo, the aircraft itself is quite well camouflaged against its background. Unfortunately, if you look at the onboard stores it's got, Those make it rather obvious. So this was a publicity shot, I suspect, but it's not quite right, put it that way. This is a rather more interesting one, that if you're talking about airborne targets, then visual camouflage doesn't really make a lot of difference in many ways. What you're more interested in is contrast. And you can see here that that aircraft is sticking out against the different background. So for airborne targets, contrast could be quite important, especially at fairly short range, depending on the weapon system you're using to defend against it. There have been experiments carried out by trying to make the aircraft, in this case, less dark. In other words, to try and be of a similar luminance to the background. Now, obviously, this has to be a dynamic situation. And in fact, in some ways, there are some parallels with what happens in nature, as we will see later on in the talk. So people have looked at putting various sorts of lights on the aircraft to make it appear lighter, so it reduces the contrast between the background and the actual object itself. So there's lots of fun which can be had there in various ways. This is one that Kent was asking me about yesterday, and I'm sure he knows the answer. This is an American, well, the aircraft there is a British one. It was an airliner, I think. I took a picture of one day in the past when skies used to be blue in summer, which they don't seem to be these days. I found that this reference on the internet to injecting rather nasty materials into the engine exhaust gases.
That's where it all went.
Yes, it's not good for the ozone layer, I suspect. There are other ways of doing it, such as cooling the jet exhaust by mixing it with air, cold air from elsewhere.
They just become ice crystals faster.
Sorry?
Then they just become ice crystals.
Yeah. So you're back to square one again in that sense. Yeah. I'm going to talk mainly about radar today as a primary sensor, and that's where a lot of my own work was concentrated. But those of you who used to be Superman fans will remember this catchphrase of, is it a bird, is it a plane? No, it's Superman. But in this case, it might be Harry Potter. So we shall have to wait and see. So when we're dealing with radar stealth, the most crucial thing really is what is the object's radar cross-section? In other words, how does it appear to a radar which is searching for the object? And this has to be measured in some way, and it's normally the radar cross-section is normally measured in so many square meters. But the thing is that for a given target, as it maneuvers around and as it's viewed by radars from different directions, its apparent radar cross-section can vary, and it also will vary with the frequency of the illuminating radar. So here it's indicating a frequency effect, but it's really how big the target is in comparison to the wavelength of the radar that's interrogating it. As we will see, a target's RCS can vary over a very wide range, and so it's normally quoted in, the figure for it is normally quoted in logarithmic form with respect to 1 square meter. So 100 square meters would be 20 dBs with respect to 1 square meter. That's what the units are there. This is an interesting comparison. What we've got here is that we're assuming a target is, say, 10 square meters RCS, and we'll say for the sake of argument that a particular radar can detect that target at a range of 100 kilometers. As we try and avoid that detection, we try and make the RCS of the aircraft, for example, smaller and smaller. So what effect does this have on the detection range? And so we show this on the other side in the right-hand column. And it's a law of diminishing returns, because if you look at the numbers there, you can see that if we reduce the RCS by a factor of 10,000, it only gains us a reduction in detection range of 10. So, yeah, sorry, Ken's gesticulating for me. You know, it's easy to start off reducing RCS, but once you want to get down to small values, then it becomes harder and harder and harder, and it becomes attention to detail when you're looking at what's going on the airframe. Here are some indicative values of radar cross-section. Obviously, real cross-sections of targets are highly classified. Although one of the references I will show at the end, which is an open reference, does give some very interesting values of what they think RCSs are for various targets. But we can see that, you know, a large target, such as an oil tanker, will have a very big radar cross-section. Now, obviously, these values are frequency dependent and aspect dependent, but we're assuming here the worst case scenarios. If we come down this list and we get down to, you know, is it a bird, is it a plane? If you look at a bird, you see that the radar cross-section could typically be much less than 1 square metre. If we come down to real values for real targets, they could be much lower. On the right-hand side, there's a photo of my hand holding a ball bearing. And when, as I understand it, the Americans were doing their initial testing on the F-117, their first stealth aircraft, they essentially found that the RCS was so small they really couldn't almost measure it. And the only way they calibrated their measurements was with comparison to steel ball bearings of different sizes. And so the RCS supposedly of the F-117 is there. So give you an idea of how small it actually is. Now, of course, that's only from one aspect. It's not from all directions, as it were, as we'll see. So this starts to tell the story about how the radar cross-section of an airborne target will vary with the direction in which you're viewing it. So we have a generic aircraft here, and the plots here show or give you an indication of the radar cross-section when the aircraft is being illuminated by a radar from a particular direction. So if we look at this one here, the target's being viewed from broadside on, and we can see that the RCS is very big. On the other hand, when you're viewing the aircraft when it's coming towards you, the RCS hopefully is very much smaller. But you can see that, if you like, the radiation patterns of the scatter patterns are very complex, and the radar cross-section can vary by many orders of magnitude if an aircraft just makes a slight change in its orientation with respect to the radar. Now here's the way that a very simple target behaves when it's illuminated by an incoming electromagnetic wave. And for this example, I need a football, and that's why we've got this here, because a sphere is the simplest radar target that you can imagine. And what we're trying to plot here is that we've got our target. We'll imagine that we've got a radar signal coming in and hitting this. Now, the signal which comes back off that will depend on the size of the ball, in this case, relative to the wavelength of the radar that's actually illuminating it. As we change the frequency, what we do is we've got this axis down the bottom here, and that is expressing the size of the ball, in this case, with respect to wavelength. So it's the size in wavelength that matters, it's not the physical size. So depending on the radar frequency, you know, you might get an RCS which is here, or it might be here, or it might be here. It just depends on how big this is in wavelengths. Now we see in the middle here that the behaviour is very complicated, and this arises because if we have the wave coming in and hitting the surface of the sphere, some of that wave will go directly back, but some of it will actually travel around the periphery of the object and then interfere with the wave which is directly reflected back. So we can see that even with a very simple target, its RCS performance, can vary over a very wide range. So when you start thinking about real shaped targets, which are by no means just like a sphere, it's very complicated. Well, here's a couple of examples of how we view things in terms of the target size expressed in wavelengths. On the left-hand side, we're viewing a fish which normally sits on the bottom of the sea. And in this case, we're viewing it at optical wavelengths. So the wavelength is very small. So the object itself, the fish, is very big in terms of wavelengths. And what we end up with, now this is cheating because it's not being looked at radar frequencies, it's being looked at optical frequencies. And it's also employing camouflage as well. So it's very difficult to actually see the outside or the area, the outside area of the fish. Where does the fish start and end? Well, it sort of comes around here somewhere, and we don't know after that where it goes because we can't really see a visible contrast between the two. On the other hand, this is an imaging radar picture of a B-52, which is viewed at quite low frequencies. So this was a measurement taken by an imaging radar on an instrumentation range. And what we see here, that for much of the structure we can't actually see it, but the very big reflectors here are firstly the cockpit, which is, get this thing to stay on, there, and then we see the inlets of the 4 engines. And we also see something happening here and here on the wingtips. So even if you had camouflaged that aircraft quite well at high frequencies, at low frequencies, you still be able to maybe image it with an appropriate sort of radar. Right, so how can we try and reduce the radar cross-section? There are various ways of doing this. The first one is to use radar absorbent materials. In other words, you have an aircraft and then you slap layers of stuff on top of it. And that was the first way that people really thought that they might do it. Conversely, you could have radar transparent materials. So the radar signal passes through the structure rather than being reflected off it. The next one was shaping, and we'll have a lot to say about shaping later on. But this is not effective at low frequencies, and I will show you some examples of that later on with data. We then have rather more esoteric techniques. There's something called passive cancellation, where we actually in some way make a phase change of 180 degrees in the reflected signal, so it interferes with the incoming signal and they cancel out. Now, of course, that's only in one particular direction. The phase cancellation will not apply in all directions, obviously. And the last one is something called active cancellation, which refers to a technique which I did a lot of work on at one stage, which is something called a smart skin. And I'll show you a little bit about that later, although not much. We like to think we're very clever, but in fact, nature has had a long time to think about all these problems of detection and avoidance of being detected. And we have a beautiful example here where we've got two insect eyes. On the left-hand side, this is the eye of a bee. And this is being illuminated by daylight because a bee flies around in the daytime. And we can see a very big reflection from the surface of that eye. Now the bee doesn't care about that because if it's going to be sort of hunted by something else, then its stripy body is pretty obvious that it's there. So doing anything to its eye is not going to make any difference to it. On the other hand, the eye on this side is that from a particular species of moth, which obviously flies at night, and it wants to minimize the reflections from the surface of its eye. And so you can see here that it's very much darker, it reflects far less. So, you know, this is thought of a long time ago, which is rather humbling, really. Well, if you look at the cross-section of the stealthy eye, so this is the one of the moth, we see that the surface of the cornea is actually not flat. It's got sort of little lumps on it. And an analogous man-made surface which has the same effect as this one down here, which is a man-made absorber, and it's typical of the sort of stuff that's used in anechoic chambers in some ways. It's not of particularly high performance, but if you're doing quick tests on things, sometimes it's quite a useful material to use. Right, the earliest operational stealth aircraft was not after the Second World War or during the Cold War. It actually flew in 1917. And here is a picture of one. It's a biplane, it's a German biplane, and they attempted to make this less visible to troops on the ground who were quite willing to shoot machine guns at it to bring it down. And what they did was that they took away the standard fabric covering of the wings and the fuselage, and they replaced it with something which was rather analogous to cling film, so you could see through it. Now there are two drawbacks to this, as there always are in these things. The first one was that you could still see the engine, and you could also hear the engine. But the other big drawback was that if this thing flew through cloud and the surface got wet, the cling film crinkled up, and so you no longer had aerodynamic surfaces. So it didn't like that and didn't fly. But at least it was a valid try of how you might start off to put some form of stealth into an aircraft. I believe that we experimented with black painted balloons, which obviously were observation balloons at night, and that was roughly at the same time. Right, what about the first radar absorbent material? Well, the first reference I can find, either in open literature or closed literature, let's put it that way, was developed in Holland in about 1936. And this was used for improving the radiation pattern of particular antennas that they were playing with. I mean, at 2 gigs, it might have been some sort of elementary link, I would think, microwave link. But essentially what it was a layer of a particular thickness, which was typically a quarter wavelength thick at the frequency of interest. And that's the electrical thickness, it's not the physical thickness. So you can reduce the electrical thickness by using materials which have permeability and permittivity. In other words, they're electric and magnetic properties. They're bigger than one being the properties of air. And this was backed by a metal backplane. So that will work as an absorber, and it can be made to work reasonably well. But it's very narrow band. The thing about radar absorbers is it's a bit like amplifiers. Amplifiers have a gain bandwidth product. In other words, you can have high gain over a narrow bandwidth, or you can have less gain over a broader bandwidth. And radar absorbent materials are rather like that. You can get excellent suppression of reflections over a narrow bandwidth, or you can get a broader response, in other words, less absorption over a wider bandwidth. But we're still only talking here about single layer materials. This was an interesting report I came across from TRE. which later became places like the Royal Radar Establishment and so on. August 1941, they obviously were thinking about this problem even at that stage, and they considered two topologies for such absorbing materials. The first one was the one we've just looked at, and this was developed quite to advanced level by the Germans in the Second World War, and was used to coat their submarine conning towers, for example. The other approach was essentially to have a resistor whose resistance is equal to the resistance of, or sorry, the impedance of free space, 377 ohms per square. And the idea is that you space that away from the metallic object you're screening by a quarter wavelength. And again, that spacer there could be some sort of dielectric material which would reduce the thickness of the layer. The conclusions from this report were that yes, we think it'll work, but it's for other people to decide whether we should actually do it. I think the truth of the matter is, looking back at the literature which you can now obtain through the National Archives, all the scientific meetings that were held at places like REE and so on this matter in the Second World War, I think there was a realization that this could not be done without a lot of work, and secondly, we didn't have the resources to do it at the time. It was much better to concentrate on our radar efforts and things like window rather than going into this area. Well, I suppose in a way, inadvertently, we did have a stealth aircraft or semi-stealth aircraft in the Second World War, and this was the Mosquito, because this was made largely of wood, but of course the engines and the propellers were still quite good reflectors. So
Don't forget the wiring harnesses.
oh yeah, that's true. Yes, and also the cockpit area with the pilots inside. So you know, there's a lot of. This was never designed with RCS in mind. It was designed to be, you know, a cheap aircraft to fly which had a very good performance. Right. So this shows the part of the conning tower of a German U-boat in the Second World War, and in fact this is covered with radar absorbent material here, and it was reasonably effective. Well, it was only a narrow band material to start with, although eventually they did start looking at materials which had a much wider bandwidth, because obviously by this time the original material was aimed at 10 centimetre radars, and then eventually they realised that we'd swapped our radar frequency such that we're dealing with 3 centimetre materials. So they had to change it. The problem was, though, that this stuff was okay, but it tended to wash off in the seas, and also it got covered with salt, and salt is quite a good reflector rather than being an absorber. So it was a good idea, but it needed some extra work, put it that way. This was another potential stealth development in the Second World War, where the Horton brothers did a lot of work on flying wings, whose shape is inherently has a low RCS, but they were going to make this out of plywood, because I guess they were running out of materials by that stage in 1945. And so they stuck the layers of ply together with a mixture of sawdust, charcoal and glue, so the charcoal in effect would act as a sort of lossy layer. And I think one of these actually did survive the war, and the Americans actually tested it afterwards, and it was found to be reasonably stealthy.
It was tested recently, and the jet engines just killed it.
Oh, right, okay. But the basic idea was good, put it that way. Right, if we now move on to 1945, in other words, after the end of the war, the UK Air Staff by that stage had obviously become aware of the nuclear bombing of Japan, and they realised what the implications were, in the sense that we would need to have a nuclear bomber as well as the weapons. And so they put together an operational requirement, and as far as we're concerned, the relevant requirement that they put forward in that document was that they were thinking about possibly anti-reflection coatings. Now, the thinking at this stage was still, we'll design an aircraft for aerodynamic reasons. Oh, by the way, perhaps we could make it a bit stealthy by sticking stuff onto it. So this was a start, but it really didn't actually solve many problems. But nevertheless, in this country, Plessey, as it then was, started work on developing radar-absorbing materials in 1947. And one of their materials, which we'll see in use in a couple of minutes, was based on a layer of rubber which is loaded with some kind of iron. And if you look at this, it weighed approximately 5 kilograms per square metre. Now, to give you an idea of what that is, if you tried to coat an entire aircraft with that, here's a piece of material. I'm not going to say any more about that, but at least I'm handing it round to give you an idea of the weight of it, that's all. But again, the material that they started with here, again, had reasonable performance over a narrow bandwidth. And that was the state of the art at that time. Well, here's the first aircraft trials that I know of in the UK, about 1955. Now, the reason why this was starting to become important was because of the V-bomber force, which obviously was under active development by that stage. And so they took this very simple propeller-driven aircraft, single-seater, and they basically stuck that sort of material over most of its surface. Now, you imagine that that aircraft probably didn't have a particularly high performance, but once you start loading it up with square meters of that stuff, it probably didn't fly very well at all. And obviously, they didn't really know what they were doing at that stage. It was stick it on and hope that something happens. Well, it did do something, but of course you've got this big propeller on the front and the nose cone and the cockpit and other bits and pieces. And so it didn't actually do a lot, but at least I guess they gained some experience on what was going on here in terms of stick-on coatings. Another approach at that stage, which happened here around about 1958, was that they made a lot of scale models of aircraft out of metal, and then they polished them so that the surface of the model was mirror-like. And then if you put that in a darkened room and you shine a light on it, you then look for the areas which reflect strongly. And there were 3 examples here. Just there as a leading edge. I can't really see. I mean, there's obviously a very strong reflection just there, probably off the side. And then the bottom one, you have to see a view from the back. There were just 2 little, it's very hard to see, but there were 2 little rings of bright light, which are the jet exhaust reflections. And so that gave them a clue as to which areas of an aircraft actually needed to be treated. So if you didn't have to cover the entire aircraft, then obviously you would save a lot of weight. Now I'll come back to this again. This was a drawing showing where they proposed to actually put the stuff on. So this was a Canberra aircraft at that stage. And then that's the actual aircraft. You can see the black layers where they'd actually put it on. Obviously here they were interested in, obscuring the view from the ground rather than airborne radars. Now, those pictures were taken out of something called the Dawson Report. Now, this report achieved mythical status in the sense that when I started to get into this area very seriously, I said, I'm fed up with the Americans, sorry Ken, boasting about what they've done in stealth. We have done things, I know, but we never talk about it. Because at one stage I did wonder whether to try and write a book on the early history of UK stealth. And I voiced this comment to a number of people, and this usually happened in the corners of rooms in whispers, and they said, "Oh, you want to see the Dawson report?" Unfortunately, it was top secret, and my classification at that stage, my clearance didn't quite, well, I was able to see it actually, but people were very loath to let anybody see it. So I'm talking now in the 1980s. And they said, "Oh, you want to look at this report? It tells you everything we knew at that time." And eventually I saw a copy of this, and I said, "You know, this is old hat. This, you know, there's far more information in the public domain that, you know, that's more interesting than this." And so I tried to get it declassified, and I only succeeded in 2007. So that's what, 47 years later. So this was a measure of how important they thought it was. I don't know why, but I mean, it's an interesting report, and you can read it if you go to the National Archives and fill in the appropriate forms. But it's not on general circulation, but it is there if you want to read it. Right, so we now move on to the sort of real problem in the sort of late 50s, early 60s, which was, what do we do about the V-bombers? Now, bearing in mind the V-bombers had been built and their shape was evolved purely for aerodynamic reasons. And then they suddenly thought, oops, we better try something, because they were designed at that stage to fly at high level. They suddenly realized that Soviet radars could pick these up from a long way away. So what can we do about it? Can we put some treatments on the airframes? And again, this is in the National Archives. You can read this if you want to. I'm not telling you anything I shouldn't. But these give typical radar cross-sections for the untreated aircraft. So for a Vulcan here, the head-on RCS was not too bad actually, and the airframe itself was not bad, but the major contribution to the RCS was the radome cavity, you know, the nose area, and the air intakes on the engines. But the rest of the structure, seen from nose on, was quite good. You did get quite strong reflections, mirror-like reflections from the leading edges, but these were very narrow angle reflections, even though they were quite large in size. The side of the aircraft was the biggest problem. I mean, you look at this enormous fin on the back of the Vulcan, and you know, they estimated the radar cross-section might be anything up to 1,000 square meters, which is huge. But you couldn't coat the entire aircraft because it literally would be too much weight. If you imagine, you know, maybe 100 square meters or something of that material I've just passed around, if you look at the weight that would have added. And the other problem was from the tail. Again, a lot of the RCS contribution was from the radar, the radar at the back, which warned you of a fighter coming up from behind you, ready to shoot you out of the sky. And also things like the jammers, which also were held in the nose cone at the back of the aircraft, and jet pipes. And green satin was a Doppler radar system for navigation. So these were some of the materials that it was thought that might be appropriate. So they've got rubber ram there, they've got expanded polystyrene. Now this is a bit like the polystyrene cups that you have your coffee in. It's essentially made up of lots of expanded bubbles of polystyrene, but there are gaps between the bubbles, and you fill that space up with some lossy material like carbon, for example. That's how that works. The bottom one was quite high tech. It was flame sprayed material, typically some sort of ceramics to cope with the high jet exhaust temperatures. So that was quite difficult. Of course, that one, ceramics are notoriously prone to thermal shock, so pluses and minuses there. We now move across the Atlantic, and I'm sure Kent knows a lot more about this than I do, but...
Bamboo.
Sorry?
Bamboo.
Bamboo, right. I believe there is, well, I believe there is an there's an aircraft, I think, I'm not sure which one it is, at the Imperial War Museum just down the road here at Duxford.
The poles were bamboo.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, I understand. And if you look at that aircraft, I don't know what it is, I can't remember, it might be a U-2, but if you can get quite close to it and you can actually inspect its surface, and you can see that it is actually covered with some sort of paint which contains little spheres of iron. I remember spending a happy hour looking at this vehicle.
Black ball paint.
Yeah, that's right. This worked to some extent. It was designed to work over the range of about 2 to 4 gigs, because that's where, at that stage, the SAM-2 missile radars worked. As Kent says, they tried to improve the RCS at lower frequencies, because the Russians were still using very many much lower range frequencies for early warning radar, because the Russians were actually quite clever, let's put it that way. And so what they did was that they outfitted the U-2 with essentially strings of wire or rope or something. I don't know exactly what the material was, but on each section they threaded ferrite beads, rather similar to the ones you use for EMC purposes. And I gather it didn't work, and it didn't make the aircraft fly very well either. So
10 dB wasn't enough.
no, I can see that. So they were still detected by the Russians, in spite of all their efforts. The first really stealthy aircraft was the Blackbird, the SR-71. It's designed, the shape has been designed with stealth in mind, unlike just choosing an aircraft shape for aerodynamic reasons. So this was the first really stealthy aircraft. Yeah, okay, I've got a long way to go yet, but I will try. This shows the leading edge of that aircraft, and you can see here a series of pyramidal or triangular dark patches, and these are pieces of radar absorbing material. Right, shaping. The F117 was made essentially out of flat plates, whereas the later B2 has a much more aerodynamically shape to it, and there's a number of reasons why that occurs. If you go back to the F117, what we show here is this being illuminated from the nose direction via radar, and we show some typical reflections from the aircraft, and you notice that because of the shape of the aircraft, the reflected signals are directed away from the direction of the radar, and more than that, they're all aligned in the same direction. So again, you get very narrow angle reflections in well-defined directions. This aircraft was made possible by the fact that there was a Russian gentleman, a mathematician, who worked out how to calculate the radar cross-section of a triangular metal plate. And for some reason, he was allowed to publish this information. And now the Americans translated all the American scientific publications quite routinely, and they spotted this and realized how important it was. So essentially then, they were then enabled to write a computer program called Echo 1, which could work out the first order reflections from an aircraft shape made entirely of triangles. And here's some examples of some runs of similar software that I ran myself. showing that aircraft. What this is showing here is the importance of wavelength, radar wavelength. We can see that at 10 gigahertz, the model that I had, which is probably not particularly accurate, had virtually no reflection when viewed from nose on, and the reflections were in very well-defined directions. If you go down to 100 megahertz, the thing acts more like an omnidirectional reflector. So this is why radars working at very low frequencies can be particularly effective against such targets. Here's an example of attention to detail on that aircraft. We notice the edges of the canopy have got what are called dragon's teeth on, and this again is because a gap between two pieces of metal can reflect very strongly. The idea of this was that if there were reflections, they would go off in particular directions.
You will also note that the glass has a gold tint.
Yes,
It's
yeah,
gold-plated.
yeah, yeah. If we come up to date, and I'm conscious that we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to skip quite a lot of interesting stuff, but during the 1990s, BAE were running a number of programs on stealth. It was part of a sort of long-running period. There was some international collaboration at that stage between companies and nations, primarily, for example, who collaborated in the Tornado aircraft, probably in the 70s, 80s. This was a long-running program which I had some little input into, but this was only announced or revealed, I think, in 2013. And this was the photo that they chose to release. The photo is a very clever one because it does tell you certain things, but it's a lot of other things it doesn't tell you, is how I will put it. In 2014, one of these aircraft, or something similar to it, or a development of it, was seen being moved around the airfield at Warton. For some reason, it was driven around very close to a public road, and someone actually took a video of it, and you can see the YouTube video online. Whether that aircraft was actually what they called replica, or whether it was actually something later, which is now called Tempest, is another matter. I'm not going to say any more than that. But Tempest was announced quite recently, although that program had been running for some time. And there is, in fact, apparently, or there was one, or a model of it at Cosford. I don't know whether it's still there or not. But interesting is what I was saying. How long are you going to give me, Graham? 2 minutes?
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Right.
Because we're way over 45.
I'll say just a few words about possible future developments or things that exist now. In 1967, another Russian mathematician called Vasilago, who I had the honour to meet once, invented or explored the possibility of having materials which had negative properties. By that I mean they had negative permittivity and permeability. But it took another 30 years before such materials were actually realised. And quite a lot of that work was done in the States, and some was done at Imperial College. But the idea of this was that we've got a target at the top here made from these materials. In this case it's a cylinder, and we have a wave coming in, a plane wave, so we've got wave fronts you can see as the red and yellow lines. So the wave front is coming in from the left, and it sort of bends its way through this cylinder and comes out on the other side undisturbed. And we notice that also there are no reflections back again. So this is quite an interesting material. It's quite difficult to put this idea into real practice. It works with simple geometries, but whether it works with more complex ones is another matter. So we're getting towards Harry Potter now. This is an example of simple optical camouflage which uses reticulated screens. So these are basically arrays of, you've got a plastic sheet, perspex, something like that, which is transparent, and then you arrange on one side of it, you have a series of essentially semicircular lenses. And in this case, I think they're arranged vertically. No details are actually given of how this works, but I'm pretty certain that's how it works. And you can see that it's acting quite nicely. And the other thing about it is that you don't, where the screen is, I mean, there's two different sizes of the screen here. There's one, it's not working well, there's one there and a bigger one over here. They don't obscure the background, so they cut off the person, as it were, but they don't replace it with a void. You see something pretty close to the original background. So that's an interesting development. Phase cancellation I mentioned earlier, where we might have a whole series of receiving antennas. You then pass the received signal through a phase shifter and then you rebroadcast it. That's the basis of phase cancellation. I've always been interested in camouflage in nature, and it's well known that, for example, the octopus can change its colour to merge in with its background. And here's an example of a fish which is doing that. It's been placed on a checkerboard and it's trying to alter its surface colour to merge in with the background. This was a concept which I came up with, well, 30 odd years ago now, where we had a microwave smart skin, and it could sense when it was being looked at, and it could adjust its properties so that it became less visible. And so you could do things like you could search for signals which were illuminating you, and you could lock onto those, and you could steer nulls onto that frequency. And at the same time as you were doing that, you could scan for other signals and then alter the appearance of the surface. Dynamically, this is in real time. This is an example of probably doing something rather similar.
Just wrap, because I think we'll need to stop.
Yeah, this is the last slide. This is an example of doing this using infrared. And here we've got a helicopter in this case, which is coated with a series of hexagonal tiles, and these can be heated up or cooled down to reduce the contrast between the vehicle and its background. So this is the sort of thing that's possible now. Right, so I better stop at that. The one thing I will just put on, if anybody wants to make a note of any of those, there's some very interesting books around in the public domain now which are quite interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Wearing my radar hat, I didn't really want to stop you, but wearing my Martlesham round table hat, we are, even though we started 10 minutes late, we're now running 20 minutes late. Paul, could you get John, who's on next and hasn't appeared, to come in? In the meantime, are there any questions for Barry just while we're waiting and getting up the next presentation?
Whether I answer them is another matter.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. This is very much of a speculation, I guess, but I know that, for instance, the B2, they say they have to do some additional stealthing up in order to it's more indetectable. So what do you hazard a guess, given the age of that design, what do you reckon they might be using for this active part of the stealthing up?
I don't think I'd want to discuss that. As a general principle, I don't want to discuss anything which might be still in current service. I'm sorry about that, but I can't.